Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Blank. I'm the editor and publisher of Blank Slate Media, and I would like to welcome everyone to a town hall on a very consequential topic, the redistricting of Nassau County's legislative districts. We have on our panel Kavan Abrahams, the minority leader of the county legislature, and Michelle Lamberti, the vice president of the Nassau County League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan group interested in good government. We are going to begin with a discussion among panel members and allow attendees to ask questions through the Zoom chat feature. We will be doing a story that will appear in our paper this coming week. And this will also be made available on our YouTube channel and on our website. We'll be emailing it out for people to view. Two notes. One is we did invite County Legislature Presiding Officer Richard Nicolello to participate on the panel. A member of his team said he would not participate if I was the moderator because I had written several editorials critical of how county Republicans had revised districts the last time, and he did not think I would be fair. He did say he would participate if a League of Women Voters representative moderated the panel, but in moderating town halls on a regular basis over the past 4 years, I think that everyone would agree that it was fair, and I felt that this would be a bad precedent that I did not want to set here. One other bit of housekeeping, I would like to thank Northwell Health for sponsoring this evening's discussion. Their support is greatly appreciated. Let me start off with Michelle. Michelle, let me ask you about this once in a decade process that takes place in Nassau County for the districts as well as across the country for state legislatures and congressional seats. Tell us about redistricting and perhaps explain that word gerrymandering.
Sure, Steve. So we are, the redistricting cycle happens every 10 years, and that's after the census. So most of you will have remembered filling out your census last year. The census is a way that we count the number of people who are in the country, and it's broken down also by state and locality. So with the number of people that are counted during the census, two things happen. The first is reapportionment, and that just means figuring out, particularly when we're thinking about the House of Representatives, there are only 425 seats. And so once we know how many people there are in the country, sometimes we have to readjust how many representatives there are per state. So you might have read, I'm sure in Steve's paper, definitely some other outlets, New York currently has 27 congressional representatives. And because of our population change, we did grow New York, but our population growth was just a little bit shy of keeping all 27 seats. So we're down to 27. That's really, reapportionment is just readjusting the number of seats we have. And in New York, that's really most applicable just for congressional seats. Redistricting is actually the process of redrawing the line. So the place that your election district is changes every 10 years. We have to adjust for people who may have moved in, people who may have moved out, changes in where your neighborhood boundaries might be, and we call that process redistricting. It's the redrawing of election district lines. And each of us live in many different election districts. So here in Nassau County, I live in Port Washington. I have a congressional district. I have a state Senate district, a state assembly district, and I also have a Nassau County legislative district and a town council district for me because I live in town in Hempstead. So redistricting matters because the way our election districts are drawn really affect our representation. So who we're able to elect when we're able to do so, but also our allocation of resources. So I'm thinking about things like funding for your schools, funding for roads, funding for hospitals, all those kinds of things. So really important. It only happens once every 10 years. And those districts are set for 10 years. They do not shift. So we're stuck with them. Steve, did you want me to give a little background on where we are in New York right now?
Well, let me start off just on the question of the league has an interest as a nonpartisan group in doing this right. So we'll get to the state and some of those other issues a little bit later. But what I wanted to ask you about is how should it be done? We've heard a lot of discussion, and the term gerrymandering is when one majority is able to shift the districts in a way that favors usually them, and to lasting effect. As you mentioned, it'll take a decade for that to change. So why don't you tell us what, as a nonpartisan group interested in good government, what should take place when they change the lines? How should that be done?
Sure. And I think it is, to move back to gerrymandering a little bit, because I think that's a term people know too. It's kind of changing the districts to affect the outcome. We do this a couple of ways. We can shove lots of voters with one or certain characteristics into one district so that district is goes that way, or we can split voters up so they don't have a lot of power. From the league's perspective, we believe that the responsibility for redistricting should generally be vested in an independent special commission. We think that membership should reflect the diversity of the unit of government, including citizens at large and representatives of public interest groups and members of minority groups. We believe in a transparent and open process. So that means a lot of public input, and with a set of standards. So it's substantially equal population, geographic contiguity, effectiveness of representation of racial and linguistic minorities, partisan fairness, preservation and protection of communities of interest. So there are a couple of criteria we generally look at, and we want to make sure that those districts are drawn to reflect the communities that live there and not really the electeds. It's not the elected selecting their voters, it's really voters being able to select an elective of their choice.
Okay, so let me ask you, Kavan, just a little background. In 2012, 10 years ago, there was a redistricting process that began. At the time, Republicans held a 10-9 advantage. Or actually, it was, I think, a little bit more than that.
11-8, maybe.
What's that?
It might have been 11-8 or 12-7, one of the two.
It was, might have been 11-8. By the time they got to the decision, there was a 10-9 advantage. And they made the change. It was 10-9, and the districts voted by the Republicans was then 12-7 in terms of registered voters in the Republicans' favor, at a time that Democrats had 20,000 more registered voters in Nassau County. So 10 years have gone by, and that really set, right now the advantage is 11-8 with Josh Lafazan winning a seat. He's an independent who caucuses with the Democrats. So that's where we are. What do you see as now you've made a proposal for how this should be handled. Tell us about that proposal.
Okay. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank you, Steve, and Michelle and Noah behind the scenes, and League of Women Voters for putting this forum together. It's extremely important. The timing is also very crucial. And as we see in what's going across the country, obviously, those of us that have been seeing what's going on in the state in regards to reapportionment and districts being drawn up, it's so vital that everyone understands how the issues actually impact them. So we have put together a proposal to pretty much substantiate independent commission as it pertains to redistricting. I've been a legislator now for 19 years, and I've seen Democrats draw the map. I've seen Republicans draw the map. The Republicans created the initial map. So from that standpoint, I feel it's most prudent that we take it out of the hands of politicians and we give an opportunity to the public to truly have a say in the process, where they would draw the lines, and there'll be less likelihoods of gerrymandering or redistricting to favor a particular party. Look, I get it. If you ask 10 Republicans, they'll say that the Democrats will draw a map that favors them, and we did that. They would say that we did that in 2003. And then you ask 10 Democrats, and they'll say in 2013, when that map was implemented, that map was drawn favorably to favor Republicans. I totally understand that. That's why it's so crucial that in order for us to move forward, that we have an independent process that is truly reflective of the people of Nassau County. It looks like the people of Nassau County. And I think from that standpoint, that was embedded in our proposal, which we've been leading the fight in terms of redistricting. It just didn't start with my letter or rehashing my letter again earlier this year. It was also, it goes back 10, 11 years. So it goes back actually to 2010. After the majority was won by the Republicans, they decided to try to implement redistricting early. So I think from that standpoint, we saw how the process could be manipulated or politicized. Thankfully, at that particular time, the courts agreed with us that obviously there wasn't enough census data, but also at the same time that the redistricting as following with prior situations, as we did the redistricting in 2003, we've never started a redistricting process while the census was still concluding. So,
Yvonne, what have you come up with? So the last time around that we went to court, there was another court case. It took 2 years to get done. I live in Roslyn. We ended up with 4 county legislators in Little Roslyn. So what are you proposing be done as the way that Nassau County this time around will be done, understanding that whatever is done this time around is going to probably going to shape the county legislature for the next decade.
Okay.
So what's your solution to making that fair for the next decade?
So number one, as I said before, it would be proposing and putting together an independent commission. Now, what would that look like? Because anyone could still question what an independent commission actually is. But we went a couple steps further. We would like to see a commission, one, that obviously does not include any elected officials. Two, it couldn't be any one of a policy or a party holder in a Democrat or Republican particular party as well. From that standpoint, three, we would also like to make sure and ensure, I should say, that we get respected individuals, folks from the League of Women Voters, as well as other entities to participate in the process. So we are talking about a completely revamping of the way we do things. Right now, the way the map is drawn, there's a redistricting commission that's put together. Basically, there's always, that I've seen in the last 2 cases, there are conflicting maps. There's a map. They try to work to develop one map, but then there's a map that comes out from the Republicans, and there's a map that comes out from the Democrats, and then the committee can't agree on a particular map. And then what ends up happening is the legislature then either takes ideas from both maps or takes ideas from the party that's in power's map, and then basically they vote on it that way. That process is completely flawed. It does not represent the people of Nassau County. It is not a reflection of the people in Nassau County. So our process would invoke that we, one, take it out of the party's hands. And it would also require that it would be implemented by the independent commission. So we would abide by what the independent commission has put together. The thought of having the legislature take action on it, I think further creates problems in the process. So from our standpoint, those are the 3 tenets that we would like to see imposed in the next redistricting process for next year.
Now, right now we don't have, and we had invited Presiding Officer Nicolello. We had asked him about that, about the last redistricting and why he wouldn't do it. And his answer has been that you would set something up and it still wouldn't be nonpartisan. It it would be no better result if you had a nonpartisan group, and it might be subject to manipulation anyway. So what has he said? You made this proposal a year ago, more than a year ago, I think. I think it was September. And what were you what has been the response? Has there been any conversation with the Republican majority and the Democratic minority party over how this is going to go?
No, our as you know, we filed our legislation well over a year ago, and that legislation has not seen the light of day. Has not had an opportunity to be heard by the public. Has not been a hearing. There hasn't been anything. Now, granted, we started that process quite early. I mean, the redistricting at the time, was several years away. But we felt it was prudent to be able to substantiate how we're going to go forward so we can start to put the pieces in place. I don't really agree with the Republican argument that it can't be improved or you'll get the same outcome. If you remove party policyholders who, on both sides, are involved in the redistricting process, if you remove people that hold party positions from that process, and you then are required to get independent, community-minded, nonpartisan folks like legal women voters and maybe folks from other different sectors of the public that are not tied into politics, you cannot tell me that the process would not be improved. I strongly believe that it would be improved. Now, granted, some of those folks may have party affiliations, and that's something that we believe would need to be worked out. But ultimately, you are not bringing in party leaders to be able to be more integral in the process. So it would have to be, and I think more likelihood, it would be improved. And obviously, we would have to iron out the kinks as we move forward with the process in the following redistricting years.
There were a couple of points. And again, we don't have, the idea would be to have Mr. Nicolello here to do it. I'm now in the position that I have to be the devil's advocate on the question. So part of that was said that the reason that the lines were drawn 12-7 was that the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department would have had difficulty if there wasn't minority representation. Is that a consideration? Do you agree with that? And is that a consideration that should be taken into consideration in a redistricting going forward?
Well, it has to be. I think if I understand what the presiding officer is indicating, so when there was an initial suit that was filed, this is going back sometime into the early 90s. As some folks may not know this, we had the Board of Supervisors. We did not have county legislative districts similar to Suffolk for decades on end. Before that, we had a Board of Supervisors and an at-large vote board. It was not representative of the people in Nassau County. There was a lawsuit that was filed that required that Nassau County draw legislative districts, particularly so that the minority communities could be properly represented. That was the reasoning and the creation behind creating legislative districts 1 and 2. One is where I represent the people of legislative district 1, and my colleague legislative Bino represents legislative 2. That was the thought process in creating those districts. So those districts had to be created in order for the process to be considered to be deemed fair, as well as representative of the people in Nassau County. Now, that being said, I'm not too sure of what the presiding officer means by that's why we had to end up with 12-7. I think an independent commission can realize the fact that you have to consider that you have to draw districts that are mindful of the minority communities in drawing, whether it's district 1 or 2 or whatever the numbers are. But at the same time, they can be able to draw fair districts and responsible districts that are representative of the people in Nassau County as well. I'm not too sure on his justification on how we got to 12-7 in citing the Civil Rights Act.
Michelle, let me ask you this. So at the time that it was drawn 12-7, there was a 20,000 advantage in registered Democrats versus registered Republicans in Nassau County. That number has grown to almost 100,000 right now. So it's 434,000 versus 335. If it was done by an independent group and you did it based on registration, that would give the Democrats a very big advantage. And how do you would that not lock in the Democratic majority for a period of time as well? Even, but you're starting to get a differential in votes. If you make it 12-7 is one shy of a supermajority, where basically the majority party can do whatever it wants. It can withstand any veto, and it's basically going to be one party making all the decisions. Is that something that you would say, hey, we might give the advantage to the Democrats, but we can't go too far because we want to have this balance in the legislature where at least there can be, they would not have the ability to approve anything one party wanted?
I mean, that's a good question, Steve. I mean, I think going back to, there are a few kind of pieces I would pull out from that. And I don't think the league would take a position that, when we're drawing lines, we shouldn't really necessarily be looking at party. Like that should not be drawing how we draw districts. That said, in a county that is, I think of active voters, but if you counted both, like Democrats clearly outnumber Republicans by a good bit. I don't think that's where you start. I don't think you start with trying to make sure the D's and the R's equal out perfectly. I think you start with the communities. I mean, because that's really where we're at. And one of the things that I would pull out that I found a little disingenuous, although he's not here, talking about, having just like those two districts drawn to represent minority communities. It's like, I really want to point out that in like the latest census, people of color represent 44% of Nassau County, okay, 44%. And Kevon will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we only have 3 representatives of color out of the 19. So our demographics are really changing. And that's a demographic question. There are protections in the Voting Rights Act, but also talks about our communities. And I think we should be looking at communities as the building blocks of districts, much less so than putting a partisan overlay. And I will say that it's not applicable for Nassau County redistricting, but the constitutional amendment that is now implemented with the Independent Redistricting Commission for the state and congressional legislative seats does provide in the Constitution that you can't favor or disfavor a political party. So it's really kind of taken out of the calculation, or supposed to be taken out when drawing districts. I think there are things that parties do as a proxy for party. We could talk about those a little bit. But in general, like, we shouldn't really be looking at party as the driving force. I just don't know if I would start from that perspective. I think if you do districting right, the numbers will work out, but I don't think it's just about looking at party when you draw districts.
So the state of New York had a referendum, passed the constitutional amendment, had a vote. The legislature, both houses, had to do it on consecutive years. And they did that. And they came up with a system, but now we're reading that, and they came up with a nonpartisan system. Now we find out, and this is in the context, so all local politics appears to have been nationalized, but now we find out that the Democratic leadership in Washington, that Senator Schumer and Congressman Jeffries, number one, they're looking at this and they would like New York to gain seats as other states, red states, are looking to gerrymander to advantage Republicans. And it turns out that a supermajority of the legislature, of the state legislature, can override the redistricting commission that was set up, that was supposed to make New York's election nonpartisan. So this is a little bit of a, I guess there's two parts. I guess let's put it in the context of national politics. We see the effort of looking to suppress votes and change votes that are taking place in state houses across the country, kind of favoring a party. And this can determine who's going to be the next House Speaker, whether it be Kevin McCarthy or Nancy Pelosi. So now the state of New York is looking at it and saying, okay, we don't want that to happen. They're cheating. They're rigging their system over there. And what happens in Texas or Florida will impact us because it'll affect who becomes Speaker of the House and who has the majority. So as a league, I guess this puts your good government ideals in a difficult situation because should New York be allowed to override this bipartisan for the greater good? So what's the league's take on what's going on right now in Albany and in Washington?
Sure. So the league's take would definitely be that just because other states are doing it doesn't mean that we should do it here. I think I would be remiss if I didn't say my league members across the country are working on redistricting in all of these states. What I would say is that the league is not happy thus far with how the process has played out. We were pleased to see that the commission did do a number of pre-hearing kind of meetings around the state to get community input, but this is definitely not how we had expected the commission to function. I don't think voters expected the commission to function in this way. I don't think that it's in the best interest of New Yorkers. To Kavan's earlier point, I think some of the things that upon further reflection, more in my personal view, looking at them, is it's a tricky makeup. It's the legislature, the way the amendment was written did give the legislature the ability to eventually override. I think when the constitutional amendment passed, the Democrats did not hold, they definitely didn't hold the Senate, and they didn't have the same supermajority. So it is just because the circumstances on the ground have changed, I don't think the rules should change. And I don't think it's in the best interest of New Yorkers. I completely understand the unilateral disarmament. I'm understanding of that perspective. And sometimes it's hard to always want to wear your good government hat. But I do think that the best process would be for New York to set a much better example by really coming to consensus around a bipartisan plan.
Now, Kavan, what happens if they go ahead? You've had on principle, the idea of fairness, that sounds good. It sounds like the top leaders in the Democratic Party in the state are kind of undermining your argument. Does this become a problem that now the Republicans in the county legislature say, well, you guys do it, why can't we? It's who's ever in the majority, to the victor go the spoils. In doing that, does this negatively impact your efforts to get what you believe is a fairer system for Nassau County?
I don't believe it helps. Obviously, what New York State does is their own prerogative. We're advocating what we believe is best in Nassau. I believe Nassau County could become less politicized. We saw it during the last redistricting process, which, look, lines shouldn't be drawn on where representatives live, but just here in Freeport, in my legislative district, there were 3 members that were drawn into the same district. I find that hard to believe that was done by coincidence. But that being said, the line should be dictated and drawn based on how the census has moved, based on likeness of the community, based on interests of the community. And while at the same time making sure that we create a process that's fair and balanced. I think most people are not cognizant on why it's so important not to give a one party rule structure. As you said before, Steve, that the legislature is structured in a way where we have 19 representatives. If any party is able to assume 13 seats, they pretty much can control bonding. They can control, make their legislation override vetoes of the county executive. And why that is important? Because if bonding and capital plans, in terms of how we get roads done, parks done, infrastructure done, if one party is in control, there is fair criticism that can be made that the other remaining 6 legislative districts, assuming one party's at 13, will not get fair representation because they really don't have much of a say in the approval of the capital bond plan. So it's extremely important, just based on your own interest, that you don't want to see either party, Democrat or Republican, assume 13 seats, just from the standpoint of trying to make sure we at least have the appearance that we have a process that's fair and balanced. Now, I could say, in our time in the legislature, the capital plan projects at several different times. We've had capital plan CRP projects, which are community revitalization plan money projects, that are not called at the same time as my Republican colleagues. I've seen that over the last 10 years. They've been delayed. And sometimes they are sitting idle in the clerk of the legislature. Now, that process could be exacerbated if you have any party, whether it's Republican or Democrat, that now control 13 seats. So I want to make sure that point is very clear to the public as well. But to get back to your original point, yes, obviously what occurs in the state can always create some level of angst in terms of our process, but we're still going to go full steam ahead. Obviously, we have an election that's coming up in a couple of short weeks. So from our standpoint, I believe that will also set some type of course in how redistricting looks going into next year. But ultimately, whether we are in the majority or we're in the minority, I'm making it our mission, my pledge tonight, of course, as well as my pledge over the last few years, that we're going to still abide by an independent redistricting commission. I think it's vital. It's just better for the legacy of the legislature to set a course of making sure that we have a fair and balanced process.
And Steve, if I could on that point a little bit, because I think there are certain things that we've learned from the state independent redistricting commission, and Legislator Abrams touched on some of those, but I think it has almost given us a roadmap in ways that we could make Nassau County better. So I think there are, for the Independent Redistricting Commission for the state, we have 10 members, 4 are each selected by elected politicals. Like maybe that's an area where we want to think about not doing it. There are only 2 independents. They are selected kind of by each party caucus. So I'd love to see a system where there are more independents, where there are the 2 parties have to come together, the 2 larger parties have to come together to collectively select people, and that the number of people who have to vote for a plan is such that you really are forced to get consensus, and that there is no legislative override. So I think there are ways, we are seeing a pathway. So I don't want to completely, discourage people. I think, Nassau could also be the leader in this front. And I really don't think, particularly where we live, we're, multicultural, we're multi-party, that we, the rancor that is exacerbated by, who even thought about redistricting to this level, 10 years ago. You see litigation starting early now. I think having a fair process really helps everyone.
In terms of the impact, just to be clear, because nothing has been set yet, Kavan, the results of this election will probably be those people that win will be the group that decides how redistricting is going to be done, and maybe even what it takes. So we're saying here that this could be, right now, the Republicans have not indicated their support for something independent, that if they win, they're going to set it. But in either case, if you do it, you're committing to the fact, regardless of your advantage, if you're 13-6, somehow you were to win that you would have this independent redistricting commission make the decisions. Is that
Yes,
correct?
yes, that is
All
correct.
right. And so basically this coming election is this election after the census returns come in once a decade will be the most important election in the decade, probably, by virtue of the fact is it's pretty well going to provide a roadmap for how elections are going to turn out for the next 10 years.
I agree.
Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Michelle, let me ask you this sort of on the bigger level of what we're watching, redistricting. So here's this enormous impact, and Kavan has given us a lot of information of where things built. Let me just quickly ask you, Kavan, have you seen the fact that the Republicans' advantage has made a difference where roads get built or buildings get constructed? Have you seen that as in there, or is that just a theoretical issue and it hasn't occurred?
So I could tell you this: the Republicans in my time in the legislature, at least, have not been to that 13-member threshold. However, I can tell you, as it pertains to legislative bills, as I said before, as it pertains to the calendaring of capital projects in our legislative process, we have had projects that in the minority, in the 8-member minority, that have sat idle, that have not been called, that have sat in the clerk of the legislature for several months. I haven't seen it to the degree that, in terms of how the money is broken up. Look, I try to be pragmatic as it pertains to how things get done. If there's a road in anywhere in the county and it needs repair, we should fix it, regardless of where it is. The money should be allocated based off of where the need is in terms of roads or infrastructure. So there may be years where we spend more money in Republican districts than we do Democrats. Doesn't mean that the Republicans are steering anything in a particular way. It just means that's where the need is. So I try to be a little bit more open-minded as it pertains to that particular process and how things unfold. However, I have sensed, as I said before, the way things are done at times in the legislature, projects are not called, and they're not called timely, and they happen to be, unfortunately, Democratic projects in what we have now is a Republican majority-led legislature. That's a reality. I think the presiding officer tries to call projects, but we see, quite frankly, things that just don't get called. So we do see that. And that's why I think it's important. And I'm saying this both ways. I'm not just talking about Republicans in the majority. I'm saying it both ways. It serves the interests of the people in Nassau County to ensure that no party gets to 13. I think it's best when we have balance. I think it's best when we have competitive districts. It keeps all of us on our toes when we have a competitive nature that exists here in Nassau County, because it makes sure that people are accountable. The other thing too, and I agree with Michelle's point, to draw lines with the premise of D's versus R's and independents and blanks or conservatives or liberals or where they live, to me is the wrong direction we want to go in. We should draw lines based off of the need, based off of the likeness of communities and how legislative districts are. Look, I mean, all because Nassau County has now an edge of 100,000 people of Democrats to Republicans doesn't mean Democrats are going to start winning overwhelmingly. We live in a moderate county. We're a suburb of New York City. So I think people vote alike. So yes, there will be Democrats that vote for Republicans and Republicans that vote for Democrats. We shouldn't try to get into the minds of residents to determine how we're going to establish redistricting. I think that we established redistricting on the premise that we wanted to have transparency and fairness in the process, and that people are represented correctly.
Now, Michelle, this is not just, we've alluded to this. Right now before Congress, the Democrats have proposed legislation, and even after Senator Manchin had his say in it and they scaled back certain provisions, gerrymandering, redistricting, the avoidance of gerrymandering, and the handling of this is stayed and is still something that the Democrats want to do, although it doesn't appear there's any Republican support for that. Can you speak to the broader issue of redistricting and gerrymandering and what it does on a national level? Because what's national, as I said earlier, affects us. If they gerrymander Ohio and that gives them enough people to elect a Republican, that gives the Republicans the majority in the House, we get a different House Speaker, and we have this discord on a national level. So can you speak to this issue of gerrymandering writ large and how it's become a bigger problem because of technology and data?
Yes, I can take a crack at that, Steve. So I would say my own personal view, and I think this is a view shared by the league as well, but when the Supreme Court decided to not really take a stand on partisan gerrymandering, I think it kind of has emboldened people. I think we lived in a very political, overly politicized environment before. I think the 2016 election kind of crystallized that. I think it was probably building for a time before that. So we are really left in this place where two things have happened, right? The highest court has decided to not really, or saying that they couldn't really figure out a good standard, what would be justiciable for partisan gerrymandering. And you also have this great data. So you have two things going on at once. And the data is really granular and it's available to all of us, which is a great thing because groups like the League, I also encourage anyone who's watching, you can go in now and access for free census data and draw your own maps. I actually suggest this, go to the League website, show you how to do it. But that combination is really tricky in states that don't have independent redistricting commissions or whose highest courts are not making decisions that limit partisan gerrymandering. So I think if you look at a state like Pennsylvania, the highest court there stepped in and used their state constitution as a way to justify striking down overly partisan gerrymander in that state. I don't know what other states will do. It really depends on the constitution of the courts in those states. I definitely know of states where even with divided government, sometimes Republicans or Democrats don't want to. Unfortunately, it does appear to be more Republicans. But in states where you have divided government, but the court is more conservative, there has seemed to be a tendency towards kind of agreeing in advance that you're not going to really agree on the plans, or knowing that you're going to litigate. So I think you're going to see a ton of litigation in the next couple of years. And absent, a different court decision, a pressure from the people that this is really not what they want, I think it's challenging. I think it's really, really challenging. And I don't think, to Kavan's point, I don't think anyone's interests are served. I think it feels good maybe when you get to always be in the majority. But I do think that policy is just better when it's not like that, and then when it's not artificially made like that.
Can you just, maybe expand a little on also how it tends to, at least outside, because again, we're talking about, we know, we see Congress people from other states, and it's not our congressperson that's doing it, but these other people are making national policy that does affect us, and their involvement, and we're getting a lot more extreme. The ability to get anything done, you're getting more people that seem to be extreme in positions like the House, and more moderate centrist people are not able to get things done. So how does it create people that are more extreme in our politics?
Well, I think you can argue that if districts are drawn really to benefit one party, a lot of times some of those districts wind up being either looking very, to use the color terms, very red, very blue. And so those races generally turn out to be races within the party, and oftentimes that pushes people to the extreme. So, in many states, in New York City is a perfect example, right? Kavan's totally right. Long Island, we're a little bit more mixed. But in New York City, that happens to be an area that is heavily Democratic. That's not necessarily gerrymandered Democratic. It just, the registrations are much more Democratic. So the real race for many New York congressional seats is really the primary. And to kind of dovetail into one of the league's other issues, like so few people participate in the primary, like so few people. So you're really incentivizing those who tend to be most polarized to pick the person that then gets selected. The same thing can play out in a very, Republican or rural district, oftentimes very red, can be very red in certain parts of the country. Same thing. So I think it kind of almost encourages this fringeness that in order to win that really small section of the electorate that votes in the primary, you're kind of pushing people to the edges. And I don't think that that's particularly good. I think in this country, we have problems around voting. I think more people should vote. I think we don't always make it as easy to vote as we should. That's a whole separate topic. But I do think that kind of fuels what we're seeing in Congress in general.
Now, Kavan, let me ask you in terms of where you are right now. So here you are waving the flag of good government, at least presented. Some people, in fairness, Mr. Nicolello said your outcome is not going to be any different than if we use the current system. But where are you now? What is the Democratic minority doing to try to get this? Is there anything that you can force on the ballot where people would vote, or are you pretty much at the mercy of what the majority decides to do on this issue?
Well, I think at this juncture, pretty much we need the majority to participate in the process. It's still my hope that they will change their tune and participate in the process and allow independent, nonpartisan redistricting to occur. I think that's important. Because sometimes we already have a bipartisan process. We're not talking about bipartisan. We want to remove politics and parties completely. So I think from that standpoint, we do need the legislature. We do need the Republicans in the legislature to work with us in that process. I believe we are too far gone from the ability to try to do it for a referendum for this year. That particular proposal, even though it would still need to be passed through the legislature to actually be calendared on for the voting calendar for November. But that process would have had to start by early summer or late spring to be able to ensure that process can go forward that way. We're really calling on the Republicans, and we're going to continue to do so. We're really calling on the Republican majority to allow a process where we have fair and balanced and independent, nonpartisan redistricting. It will set a tremendous message, not just for the election cycle coming up in 2023, but for years to come, well beyond anyone that is serving the legislature now.
Has any Republican, have you garnered any support from across the aisle? Has anyone said, I could support that if you did this?
Unfortunately, no. I mean, in a perfect world, Steve, our like any legislation, our legislation would have been calendared. It would have received a hearing. I mean, if there were concerns or potential for changes or proposals, it would have come out of that hearing. If there was more bipartisan talk to be able to us to see how we would go forward, we would basically have it that would occur during a legislative meeting. None of that has happened. We haven't even started the process, the initial steps of a process, by scheduling a public hearing so that the public can hear and there could be debate and discussion among the legislators. And at the same time, there could be public input. We haven't even started that process. So we are so far behind. I mean, as you know, the redistricting process is going to start to commence in 2022 for us. Maps are going to be implemented shortly after in 2023. We still have time to do so. We can definitely try to push to do some type of public referendum sometime in 2022, but that's really when the process should be starting to begin for us. We really wanted to be able to work with the Republican majority to be able to try to put something in without it having to go to a public referendum, just the people of Nassau County being properly represented by their legislators in the county.
We have a question from one of our attendees asked the question, if there's a vote and it becomes a party line vote that Democrats oppose the outcome, assuming they're in the minority after the election, can the county executive veto it, or is it strictly the power of the, or is it strictly in the power of the county legislature? If the county executive is a Democrat, can she be a check on the legislature if it's dominated by the other party doing something that he or she objects to?
Okay. A lot of hypotheticals there. I'll try to answer the best I can. So assuming that we still have the same makeup in the legislature, and assuming the county executive is still there, because obviously, as folks on the Zoom understand, she's also up for re-election this year. Yes. So the county executive has the power to veto the map. So in the event we have this is going with the hypothetical, if assuming we have the same makeup where we have an 11-8 Republican-led majority legislature, and we still have a Democratic county executive, then in essence, yes, that Democratic county executive could veto the map if she feels that it wasn't a fair and transparent and truly bipartisan process. But we shouldn't proceed with that process just because the county executive has the ability to be the checks and balance to the Republican-led legislature. We should proceed with a process that, regardless of whether it's a Republican county executive or a Democratic legislature, we should proceed with a process that ensures, regardless of that makeup, it shouldn't matter, that it's going to ultimately be independent at the end of the day. So I think from that standpoint, yes, in this particular case, the county executive could veto a Republican-led legislature map. But I could tell you 10 years ago, when the county executive was a Republican and the legislature was Republican, we didn't have that checks and balance. And from that standpoint, we saw a process which I truly believe wasn't as transparent as the people in Nassau County deserve. So I think from that standpoint, who's in elected office, or who's in office, what party's in office, what party holds the legislature versus the county executive. Yes, that could work out in this case, assuming the legislature looks the same and the county executive is reelected. But we shouldn't be able to fall back on that, because that can easily begin to fall apart. Our process and our mindset should be focused on independent redistricting and having a commission that does that.
Now, the last time around, it ended up in the courts. There was a series of public hearings. It did end up with the courts. Do you think that that's where we're headed? In terms of, it didn't happen until 2014 last time. You started you say in 2010, it didn't end until 2014. Is this something that we may not know the maps until 2 or 3 years down the road?
It's all very possible. Every time we go into a process, if there are a group or entities that feel that the process has not been transparent, that it wasn't truly representative of the people of Nassau County, lawsuits can always be brought. I would say that tonight it's important that my Republican colleagues are hearing our message, because I truly believe if you remove the politics away from the process, you definitely create less of a opportunity for that type of stuff to happen. So yes, we could end up back in court. Obviously, if the legislature violates any components of the charter, we have to make sure that those components are representative in this process. So from our standpoint, we're going to make sure that whether we go forward with the process that we have or the process that hopefully we could be, we're going to make sure that at the end of the day, the people in Nassau County are represented properly.
Now, Michelle, you're kind of, Kavan is a combatant, and he's on one side of this, and we have the Republicans on the other. That are nonpartisan and looking at this. But what do you look at in terms of what people who are the residents, the voters of Nassau County? There are going to be public hearings. There were last time. But what do you think, what ought the public do in looking at this? Because they're going to cast their vote in November for whomever they're going to choose in the legislature. But then there's going to be another decision that they have a right to participate in when it comes to determining the districts. So you as somebody supporting good government, what ought to voters do after the election to ensure that elections are the outcome of these elections are done in a fair way for the next decade?
Yeah, I mean, I would even say that they could start earlier, Steve. So I'd say before the election, the league is hosting, not to tout our own thing, we are going to be hosting candidate forums. I know there are other outlets that are doing them as well. I would ask the people who are running for those offices their views on independent redistricting. Like, what do they feel about it? So we can wait until then, but I would start now. We ask it often. It does come up at our forums. Get the person, get the views of the person that you're thinking about voting for. Are they committed to an independent process? I think for next year, when we enter the redistricting process in Nassau County, make your voice heard. Like, don't be quiet. Show up at the public hearings, join with the league and other good government groups. I think because going to your earlier point, Steve, about how we've really become pretty polarized and there's so much data, I do think there's much more focus on redistricting now than there was 10, 20 years ago. So I think there will be more focus on the people who are also doing the redistricting, and there are just greater tools for you to get involved. So, we do trainings. I encourage you to testify. It's very easy to testify. I would encourage you to submit maps of what you think your community looks like, but really don't go quietly. That's the whole thing. Like, you need to let the electeds know that you're paying attention and that this is an issue you care about. I think we've laid out all the reasons why you should care, but I think holding electeds accountable is really important, and participating in that process as it begins.
So let me just one final question. Is this an important, I'll let you both answer this. Is this an important enough issue? Because there are a lot of issues that go into why you vote for a candidate. I think Ed Koch famously said that if you agree with me on 7 out of 10 issues, you should vote for me. And if you agree on all 10, you should see a psychiatrist. So we do take a lot of issues in terms of how we make our decision. But how important is this? Should this be something where you can decide who you're going to vote on based on their willingness to on how they would do the redistricting process?
Come on, you want me to go first? I mean, listen, there are a lot of issues.
Ahead.
Like, voters are not we're all multifaceted people. I don't think there is, for some voters, there's one issue that matters the most to them. But I think when you are evaluating candidates, their commitment to a fair and democratic process is foundational. And so we care about what we think an elected might think about water or about finance or about taxes. But I do think, for me personally as a voter, it is like a very high criteria. Like, are you committed to a democratic process that's fair? And I think if you want a process that looks a little bit better than it does now, then the answer to that is yes. Now, is that like always determinative? No. And each voter has to make up their own choice. But I don't think there is a downside in being vocal that this is an important issue for you. I think Kavan might mention, like, electeds will start to listen. Like, if you raise this as an issue that really matters to you, it may not be the only issue you're voting on, but it will raise the visibility of the issue. And I do think electeds pay attention just to what people are paying attention to.
Go on.
I tend to agree with Michelle. I think I think most voters probably have some type of level of understanding of the process. But more importantly, I think most voters think that at the end of the day, if the Republicans are in power, they should draw the lines. If the Democrats are in power, they should draw the lines. And I think where most voters don't understand or sometimes are not cognizant of the fact that we should never want any particular party to have one party rule and be able to control things up and down from the county executive through a supermajority in the legislature. And I think that's what's good for Nassau County, to ensure that we have fair and balanced competitive districts, because at the end of the day, you want to ensure, whether it's Kavan Abrahams or any one of my colleagues, you want to ensure having competitive districts that legislators stay on their toes, that they're going to be responsive to you day and night. And the way you ensure that is by having competitive, independent, fair districts that are drawn to ensure that that process takes place. So I think it's crucial that we continue to let voters know that message and ensure that we have a fair process going into it. But as Michelle said before, and I agree that I think if you poll residents on their top 5 issues, redistricting may not be the highest issue on their platform. Obviously, making sure that their families are safe and they have an affordable community, and making sure that taxes continue to try to stay moderately where they are or reduce them. I mean, I'm sure tax is a big issue. So there are many issues that I think Nassau County residents have, and maybe redistricting doesn't resonate to the top, but I truly believe it should. Who represents you and the process in place to on how they represent you is completely should be at the forefront of Nassau County voters.
All right. Well, I want to thank both of you for a very informative, very interesting discussion. Michelle Lamberti of the League of Women Voters, Kavan Abraham, the minority leader of the county legislature, thank you very much for participating. I want to thank once again our sponsor, Northwell Health, and also let you know, I'll also ask you guys to support community journalism and your local newspapers that provide forums such as this. We also have a very robust discussion on issues like this. Apparently it got me in trouble in our opinion section as well as our news section, and ask you to support the paper. We are going to, one of our reporters has covered this event, and we'll be reporting on what the discussion was. We also will be having, this is going to be on we have a YouTube channel. Please sign up to our YouTube channel. And we're going to be sending this out by email, and you can also come see it on our website, theislandnow.com. Once again, I thank our panelists on our forum from a very informative discussion, and look forward to hearing you as this issue continues. I don't think we've heard the last of this in the next several months, if not years. So again, thank you, and everybody, thank you for attending, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.